The games industry has no shortage of terribly run, poor quality studios and publishers, and just when you think we've reached maximum capacity, 5 more pop out of nowhere like surprise Marvel cameo appearances. It's like a giant game of whack-a-mole, except instead of disappearing when you hit them with a mallet, they just start harassing people and selling you NFTs. As far as hated game companies go, Ubisoft is one of the GOATs.
That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
They are indisputably one of the best to ever do it, but they didn't start off as a generational talent in the art of making bad decisions. Ubisoft has created a lot of classic franchises. They have a giant well of potential. They're responsible for some of the most influential and recognizable series of the 21st century and have an influence on the flow and trajectory of the games industry. People have been kicking rocks at Ubisoft for a long time for being a terrible company, but for most of that period, I found them to be less evil and more just boring. They have made a lot of generic stuff and don't really treat franchises like Splinter Cell and Prince of Persia with much respect, eventually relegating them to the sidelines or to novice teams that fumbled their development. But they weren't the worst offenders of some of the worst practices, so I gave them a bit of a pass. They weren't the devil, they were just that weird company off to the side that made okay games sometimes. You'd snag them 6 months down the line when they were worth a 20th of what they were on release and then see them in another year and a half. But in the last couple of years, in almost every way a company can screw up, Ubisoft has screwed up. They rely even more heavily on their big name series now without backing them up with much substance. Their games are underperforming as less are making it out of the pre-production stage and even less are actually hitting shelves. They're breaking all the records you don't want to break. Their stock is plummeting. They were added for a horrible culture of harassment that's apparently run rampant in their offices for over a decade. Employees are being forced out because they were scumbags. More important, employees are not being forced out despite being scumbags. The CEO is blaming the developers are trying to push back openly, and I think it's safe to say that some major changes are desperately needed. They've been whittled down to their last few successful franchises, and nearly every news piece on the company over the last 2 years has been bleak. While a few of their endeavors are still performing financially, the future of Ubisoft doesn't look very bright. When you visit a new country, it's not uncommon to try and greet the locals in their own language, so given I'm visiting the wacky tobacco world of Ubisoft, tagline "Nobody leaves here unharassed," let's try and do the same thing right now, speaking the only language that any company ever really speaks: money. I want to take a look at a few sales figures and the overall stock of Ubisoft real quick, and while of course stock doesn't directly tell us how games are selling or what the future holds, it does tell us how much investors believe a company is worth and how stable that company's plans are for the future, and it seems like over the last couple of years, Ubisoft hasn't really made a very convincing argument for themselves. Ubisoft stock as of the day I'm writing this is at about 19 euros, which isn't actually anything to worry about on its own. In fact, if we look incredibly selectively at the data, it looks pretty good compared to the roughly 4 euros it was at about 10 years ago, but of course that's not the whole story. We tend to forget how much gaming has grown over the last decade overall. Nearly every big games company was worth pennies as we flipped over to the 2010s compared to what they are now. They were also all propelled forward just before the mid-2010s when the PS4 and Xbox One released. Activision, EA, Square Enix, and of course, Ubisoft. Of course, these companies still had to prove their potential to ride that wave. It wasn't just automatically given to them, and Ubisoft did in fact prove its potential, increasing its value tenfold between late 2013 and mid-2018. From about 2017 onwards though, it largely maintained its price for years with a few natural fluctuations, until it began to drop drastically in January of 2021. Almost exactly 2 years on from this, Ubisoft stock is now at about a quarter of what it was when the dip started, about a fifth of its peak in 2018, and the lowest it's been in 8 years. Now, Ubisoft has had its peaks and valleys in the past, there's no doubt, as have their peers, but there's a few things that make this concerning. The first is obviously that the previous jumps and dips from Ubi have been on a much smaller scale. The second is that during these previous valleys, there's been a bit of a hidden counterweight that doesn't seem to exist today, which we'll get to in a second. And the third is that no other game companies that could be appropriately compared to Ubisoft have seen such a harsh and sustained decline despite the hot water that all of them are getting into. Of course, we could look at companies like Capcom and Nintendo to see how publishers with relatively good publicity nowadays are doing, but how about we look at a company like Activision Blizzard? In the last couple of years, they were exposed for a similarly horrible work culture at a similar scale to Ubisoft, produced one of the worst performing Call of Duties to date, to many people dropped the ball with Overwatch 2, made tons of games designed to milk the player for all their money, including the infamous Diablo Immortal, lost their CEO because he's a weirdo, and are now facing issues with their Microsoft deal. And while it hasn't been the smoothest sailing, and there was a concerning dip in 2018, they bounced back a few short months later and have remained back near their old price ever since. And does that make me less confident in the importance of ethical business practices and their effect on the bottom line? Sure, but how much confidence did I really have in that before anyways? As much as this does kinda suck to see considering how terrible of a company they are, it also shows just how hard you have to work to fall off in this industry. Both instances of Activision stock dropping significantly were over concerns around player base and flat sales growth, particularly with Call of Duty, and both were met with a gradual upswing just a few months later. You know how EA is kinda seen as the boogeyman of gaming? Here's their graph. You know how Square Enix literally gave away their Western studios for $5 and a can of Coke before saying they were going all in on NFT projects that are currently bombing? Here's their graph. From my research, I couldn't find any game publishers with a similar stature to Ubisoft that effectively unclimbed the mountain they summited in the mid-2010s. The only exceptions are Tencent for a short spell, but they have way more individual investments in different fields, and you could argue Take-Two, although in their case they seem to have just gone back to their somewhat stable pre-COVID numbers as of right now. Ubisoft may be putting out some of their most profitable individual games to date, but their slate has become so top-heavy and their upcoming projects are in such turmoil that any respectable sales figures are offset by the circus around them. Not to mention that unlike their previous rough stretches over the years, the general consensus on Ubisoft products is probably the most negative it's been in the entire history of the company. To anybody who's wondering why Ubisoft moved away from focused single-player experiences without shoehorn marketplaces into video games that are basically just glorified storefronts, here's some stuff to consider. These are some of the most important and positively received games that Ubisoft's ever produced over the years. If you superimpose their release dates onto the graph from before, you can actually see that some of the most creative stretches in Ubisoft's history match up with their worst performing years. They were selling at less than €10 when putting out Rayman 2, Splinter Cells 1 through 4, Ghost Recon, Beyond Good and Evil, Far Cry 1, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, and the all-time classic Playboy the Mansion. And even after making more of a name for themselves following that stretch, complete with an uptick in price, they fell back to a similar range of under €15 in years that included Assassin's Creed 2 through Unity, Rayman Origins and Legends, Far Cry 3, the birth of the Just Dance series, and remasters of a lot of their classic titles. While other factors are involved, including their promises of games to come or restructuring of the company, their most financially successful period contained titles like The Division, the new RPG MTX Assassin's Creed trilogy, Far Cry 3 2, Far Cry 3 3, Far Cry 3 4, Far Cry 3 with Stick, more Just Dance, and some Watch Dogs. Not all of these games were terrible, but they are what defined the new Ubisoft. Mostly generic, pretty empty, and littered with marketplaces. They didn't resonate with fans quite as much as years or decades prior, but it didn't matter. They were designed to be money printing machines. It clearly worked too, because a lot of the games in this era became among Ubi's highest earners. The dropping stock price right now is a reflection of an unstable future, potential structural changes, and some serious commitment issues, not a holistic lack of game sales themselves. In fact, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, despite not being met with resounding positivity, was the series' first game ever to earn $1 billion as a result of its microtransactions. But as much as Ubisoft has seemingly profited by transitioning fan-favorite franchises into large-scale grifts, I think that decision is incredibly short-sighted. Long-term goodwill with your individual series is still incredibly important, especially when there are so many viable alternatives. Ubisoft may not have been making the most money in the late 2000s and early 2010s, but at least as a counterpoint, they were developing the games that would create some of their most die-hard fans. There's something to be said for AC2 or Far Cry 3 turning those series into household names, even if they were dwarfed profit-wise by recent games. AC Valhalla wouldn't be a big deal if Assassin's Creed wasn't a big deal, and Assassin's Creed wouldn't be a big deal if not for this early era of the series. In a time when Ubisoft was struggling financially, it was essentially banking some brownie points in the process. It isn't an ideal place to be business-wise, but it can pay dividends in the future and dig you out of any trenches you might find yourself in. Unfortunately, there doesn't really seem to be anything like that to bank on now. Player satisfaction nowadays seems to be way down in comparison to the last dip. You need to scroll through 3 pages of Ubisoft's highest Metacritic scores to find anything that came out in the last 5 years. The Far Cry franchise has had a pretty linearly negative progression since 3 from critics and users. Assassin's Creed reinvented its format to save itself from a similar fate, although the fatigue has started to settle in on the new one, and everything else has been crashing and burning on release. Valhalla is a juggernaut, it's true, and although we don't have a specific breakdown on how much it made from sales versus microtransactions, it does seem to have a pretty healthy player base. But its reception was still very mixed, and it doesn't have as much of a stranglehold on the open world market as something like Call of Duty has on shooters, which begs the question, how long can this be kept up? How long can Ubisoft continue to take a hit on its reputation and the quality of its games and still increase or maintain its revenue through systems that are more and more predatory with each iteration? If this rough financial stretch, which is bigger than any of their main franchises on their own, is accompanied by an all-time low public perception and game reception, what do they have to bounce back with? Mario & Rabbids was one of the studio's most positively received games of the last few years, but the sequel, Sparks of Hope, performed poorly despite being well received, likely because of bad marketing. In 2019, Rainbow Six Extraction, Watch Dogs Legion, and Immortals Fenyx Rising were all delayed at once because of the disappointing sales for Ghost Recon Breakpoint and The Division 2. Two big franchises that look a little bit ropey at the moment, particularly Ghost Recon, which cancelled its Battle Royale game in Frontline. When those 3 games finally released, Immortals seemed to do pretty solid for what it was, but Watch Dogs and Rainbow Six were met with a lot of criticism at launch. They didn't flop out of the building or anything, in fact they did pretty alright, but they didn't build much confidence in the franchises either. Extraction didn't have anywhere close to the cultural impact of Siege, and Watch Dogs is still not the juggernaut Ubisoft wants it to be after being outwardly disappointed with Watch Dogs 2's sales. We've already discussed the criticism with their other heavy hitters in AC and Far Cry. Just Dance 2023 also underperformed, and most of their new IPs have been met with some pretty rough fates. We don't know what exactly is going to happen to Roller Champions yet, but considering it launched on Steam just a few months after release and had a highest concurrent player count of a whopping 134 people, I feel pretty confident in saying I could probably fit more people into a real-life roller rink. And their big Battle Royale and Hyperscape was wiped off the face of the planet less than 2 years after it launched. Commercial success for their games is a mixed bag, and critically their games have never been under more scrutiny. But at least they have a great plan for the future. You see, because I was being sarcastic. Ubisoft's tactic for developing games seems to have shifted from creating bad games to just not making games at all. Ghost Recon Frontline wasn't their only recent cancellation. They also canned a Splinter Cell VR game and 5 other unannounced projects, all in the span of 6 months. Not just that though, I already mentioned their habit of mass delaying big games due to poor sales, which was showcased back in 2019, but at this point, announcing delayed games from Ubisoft is practically a full-time job. The Sands of Time remake was originally slated for 2021, but was then delayed by a few months for quality purposes, only to then not only be delayed again, but completely change development teams because, and I believe this is the technical term, it looked like donkey butt. Skull and Bones has now been delayed 6 times. 6 times! How do you get the date wrong 6 times? You could have thrown a dart at a calendar 6 times and probably hit the actual release date by pure chance. And as for Beyond Good and Evil 2, it actually hasn't been delayed yet to its credit, but that's also because it never got a date because it's basically not real. The game got its first and only trailer 5 years ago, but it was first confirmed over 15 years ago. And recently it surpassed Duke Nukem Forever as the sole record holder of the longest time spent in development hell, a truly prestigious honor. It lost its director in 2020, the same guy who created the Rayman franchise, who left out of the blue right before the studio was investigated for sexual harassment and other misconduct, and I guess make of that what you will. And the big kicker is that this is still in pre-production, as in the part before production. They're still trying to figure out what the hell this game is even after dumping 15 years into it with no end in sight. Actually, scratch that. No beginning in sight. They're in pre-production. And if you think I'm cherry picking the worst upcoming games to make a point, I'm really not. If we take a look at IGN's current list of upcoming Ubisoft games, there's 5 Assassin's Creed projects, the infamous Beyond Good and Evil, Skull and Bones, and Prince of Persia remake, a free-to-play Division title, an Avatar game. I bet you forgot they were making an Avatar game because yes, that was delayed as well and we basically know nothing about it. A new shooter that's just concept art right now, a new Settlers game that has its own rough history and has, oh look at that, been delayed indefinitely. Another free-to-play shooter, a Splinter Cell remake, and a super secret Star Wars game. 90% of that list is either in shambles on indefinite pause or Assassin's Creed, and outside of those games, Ubisoft seems to be going all in on the mobile market. All things considered, this is an absolute joke, and funnily enough, the company seems to know it. Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot has some interesting takes on the company's struggles. He doesn't actually deny the problems, but claims that they stem from major challenges as the industry continues to shift towards mega brands and long-lasting titles. Essentially, his take is that Ubisoft was not working on games that gamers wanted to see, which is true, so good job on reading the room. Almost. Because he seems to be under the impression that what gamers do want are live service games that will last forever. And you know what? It's kinda hard to disagree with him, especially considering the performance of Marvel's Avengers, Fallout 76, Anthem, Halo Infinite, Battlefield 2042, Babylon's Fall, Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and The Division, some of which I believe might be vaguely familiar to the head of Ubisoft. Live services aren't destined to fail, and they might just be the future. A few of them have even done well already, but they are overall off to a rocky start. Do you also remember how I said that Ubisoft is becoming dangerously top-heavy, with its big franchises carrying most of the load despite sitting on thin ice with the general public? Well, in a stroke of genius, Yves also plans on focusing more of the studio's energy away from new IPs and onto their bigger franchises, a move that seems to have manifested itself partially in AC Infinity. It's kind of unclear what this is exactly. It's been pitched as a big launcher for Assassin's Creed games that'll unify them all in some way, to which I gotta ask, isn't that what a fucking console is? I mean, I don't know, they haven't really described it very well, so maybe it'll have unique features, but if there's one thing I know, it's that taking franchises and development teams that have found success in single-player projects and forcing them to put out live service counterparts has always turned out well. Yves didn't actually stop there though, following the age-old rule of say 3 stupid things in a row and they'll cancel each other out, saying directly to his employees, "I am also asking that each of you be especially careful and strategic with your spending and initiatives to ensure we're being as efficient and lean as possible. The ball is in your court to deliver this lineup on time and at the expected level of quality, and show everyone what we are capable of achieving." To everyone's shock, this sort of pissed people off, considering so many of the errors, the poor marketing strategies, the unfocused releases, the NFT integrations, the horrible time management, and so much more were a direct result of upper-level mismanagement. And Yves was now asking each of his teams and employees to cut the fat off their own projects that he was demanding from them. He later apologized and claimed that he only meant to clarify how important the talent at Ubisoft was to its success, but considering he was also doubling down on his clear misunderstanding of the situation the studio was facing and why they were in the position they were in, that apology wasn't taken very seriously. The brazenly stupid comments made by Guillemot paired with the horrible scandal that broke out about the company's work culture just 2 years back, a scandal which reportedly hasn't led to much internal change at the studio, have created a major rift between the actual developers and the higher-ups at Ubisoft. The company is openly struggling to maintain its relationship with its developers, its fans, and its investors all at once. They're dumping finances and resources into projects that result in, at worst, nothing, at best, half-finished experiences, and at mid-list, some of the biggest money pits in the industry. They are tripling down on their big franchises and live services despite how volatile and fatiguing they're getting, and they haven't made anything in the last few years that fans can connect to on the same level of their early 2000s or early 2010s set of games. They may just get bailed out of their ridiculous decisions if a couple of important projects can somehow find their footing, their very public restructuring somehow paying dividends despite how tone-deaf it sounds. But equally as likely is that without significant restructuring at the very top of the company, we might just be seeing the death of one of gaming's biggest studios in real time. I guess the ball's in their court.